Today's story. My husband insisted that every time I came home, I had to ring the doorbell exactly 4 times before entering. One day, I forgot to ring it. When I opened the door, the sight before me left me paralyzed with fear. Boston, in the early days of winter, is unforgiving. The freezing drizzle falls like spiderwebs across the city streets, and the biting wind howls through the alleyways of our old historic brownstone building, making the iron gates creak. On days like this, all anyone wants to do is rush home and pour a hot cup of tea to warm their soul. My name is Hannah Carter. I am 32 years old, and this is my story. I worked as a forensic auditor for a few years before transitioning into risk compliance consulting for corporate firms. The job sounds dry, but it taught me one invaluable lesson. Everything leaves a trail, especially money, and especially deceit. My husband is Kevin Miller. He is 3 years older than me and works as an architect. Anyone who meets him would describe him as gentle, impeccably clean, and composed. He's the type of man who speaks little but does a lot. At home, he is so meticulous that I once joked, if you were the judge of a clean house competition, this entire neighborhood would fail. He didn't laugh out loud, just gave a faint smirk. A clean house makes for a clear mind, he'd say. We had been married for 4 years and didn't have children yet. We lived alone in a small condo inside an old, classic Boston walk-up. It was genuinely old. The brick walls had patches of water stains, and the shared stairwell always carried the scent of damp rain mixed with the smell of someone cooking dinner. But in exchange, our apartment was always tidy and secluded, like a small, safe box where the two of us could hide from the noise of the outside world. The only regret was our lack of children, which felt like a splinter stuck in my throat. Talking about it was awkward. Not talking about it was painful. And to be honest, that pain didn't come from my own desires as much as it came from my husband's family. My mother-in-law is Barbara Miller, a woman in her early 60s, her hair always perfectly styled, her outfits immaculate. She spoke softly, but every sentence had a hook in it. She never yelled or used foul language. She just reminded you of things in a sweet voice, but it was the kind of sickly sweetness that leaves a bad taste in your mouth. Every time we visited, without fail, she would ask, "Is work going well, dear?" Before I could even sigh in relief and answer, she would immediately add, "Well, that's good, but a woman's true worth is the home she builds. And a home isn't truly settled until there's the sound of children running around." Hearing that, I could only smile. I smiled out of politeness, looked down, and poured the tea, my hands shaking slightly while pretending everything was fine. People always say, "Bite your tongue to keep the peace." I had bitten my tongue so many times that I sometimes wondered where the peace was. I only saw myself slowly eroding. My father-in-law, William Miller, was entirely different. He was a quiet, gentle man who spent most of his time sitting on the porch, looking out at the yard, occasionally letting out a dry cough. He never pressured me, never asked intrusive questions. But there were times during dinner, right after my mother-in-law dropped one of her passive-aggressive hints, I would see him quietly put his fork down and look away, as if swallowing a heavy sigh. My brother-in-law, Dylan, is 7 years younger than Kevin. He works as a field engineer. We rarely saw him because he traveled constantly for construction projects, but whenever he was home, he was pleasant to talk to, and sometimes he even came to my defense. Like one Thanksgiving, my mother-in-law gave a tight smile and said, "The neighbors already have grandchildren to hold this year." Meanwhile, our family, Dylan, who was taking a bite of turkey, suddenly looked up. Mom having kids is up to fate and timing. Saying things like that just puts pressure on Hannah. Barbara glared at him sharply. "Fate and timing. You men say that because it's easy for you. The woman is the one who bears the responsibility." Her words dropped onto the dining table like a heavy spoon hitting a metal pot, not loud, but it echoed. I loved Dylan for trying, but I also felt bad for him stepping in. I understood that in this family, my mother-in-law's words carried the weight of lead. Whoever touched them was bound to get bruised. As for Kevin, he chose silence. His silence wasn't abandonment, but rather the stance of a man standing between two strong winds, keeping his head down to avoid both. He would often reach under the table, grab my hand, and give it a reassuring squeeze, as if to say, hang in there, honey. But sometimes I asked myself, hang in there until when? It was against this backdrop that Kevin established a very bizarre, yet seemingly practical, ritual. The day we moved into the condo, while I was still busy wiping down the cabinets, he called out, "Hannah, let's agree on one rule from now on." I looked up. What rule? He pointed at the front door, a heavy, thick security door, with a deadbolt. Whoever comes home last has to ring the doorbell, exactly 4 times, just one specific pattern. 2 short rings, 1 long, 1 short. Asterisk, ding ding, 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 asterisk, asterisk. Then you unlock the door. I laughed out loud. Oh my God, like a secret lover's code? He looked dead serious, which was almost comical. I'm not joking. This door is thick. If you just knock, I might not hear it over the TV. Plus, you know what they say, better safe than sorry. It pays to be careful. Just ring it to be sure. I raised an eyebrow. An architect who believes in superstition? He shrugged. I believe in security. And so, from that day on, the 4-ring doorbell became a habit. When I came home from work, arms full of groceries, I still made sure to stop for a second in front of the door, press times ding ding, dying, ding asterisk, and then put my key in the lock. Kevin did the exact same thing when he came home late. There were nights I was sitting in the kitchen and heard those exact 4 rings, and my heart would warm. It felt like someone was knocking on the door to my heart, not just the front door. I often thought a woman's life only needed that much: a roof over her head, a decent husband, and a small, comforting habit. But you can't wrap fire in paper. Sometimes, that comfort is just a blanket thrown over something waiting to show its face. The night before everything started, Kevin and I had a perfectly normal conversation. But looking back now, it feels like the eerie calm before a hurricane. He had just finished setting the coffee maker for the next morning when he asked, "Let's go have dinner at my parents' house this weekend, okay?" I hesitated for a second. "If you want to go, we'll go. I won't stop you." He turned to look at me, his eyes gentle but exhausted. "Mom talks a lot. Don't take it to heart." I exhaled. "I don't take it to heart. I just feel like I'm trying my hardest, and everyone looks at me like it's never enough." Kevin put down the coffee scoop, walked over, and gave me a quick, unpretentious hug. "I know. I just worry you'll feel sad dealing with it alone." I leaned against his shoulder, taking in the familiar scent of his soap. In that moment, I truly believed he was my safest harbor. I had no idea that right inside this small apartment, there was a dark zone he had constructed, and that those 4 rings of the doorbell might not have been a romantic greeting, but a predetermined buffer of time, just enough time to hide something. That night before bed, I even joked, "When you come home tomorrow, make sure you ring it right, or I'm fining you." He chuckled softly. "Yeah? What's the fine?" I squinted at him. "You have to cook and do the dishes for a whole week." He let out a rare, somewhat trendy phrase without sounding cheesy. "Please, don't make me carry the team that hard." I laughed and turned off the lamp. Listening to the freezing drizzle pattering against the roof of the building, I drifted off to sleep with the simple belief that tomorrow would be just another normal day, that the 4 rings would echo warmly, and home would still be home. But in life, sometimes forgetting a single habit just once is enough to open a completely different door. Not the door to an apartment, but a door leading straight into a dark secret. The next morning, Boston was still trapped in a leaden gray sky. The freezing drizzle wasn't heavy, but it was relentless, clinging to hair and coats like an annoying reminder of the cold. I woke up early, brewed a quick cup of ginger tea, took a sip to wake myself up, and hurriedly put on light makeup to make it to a meeting with a major client. Kevin was his usual self, quiet, not dawdling. After breakfast, he neatly gathered the dishes and wiped the kitchen counters spotless. Before leaving, he gave me a very quick glance, as if he wanted to say something, but then stopped himself. I didn't push it. I knew that prying into domestic moods early in the morning could turn into unnecessary heaviness. That day was the day I had to close a massive risk assessment contract. My job has no stage lights, no applause. It only consists of data, liabilities, clauses, and accountability. Yet, strangely, every time I signed off on a clean contract, I felt like I had won a small victory in my life. By 3 p.m., the client signed the papers, and a huge weight lifted off my shoulders. I stood up, shook hands, and recited the standard polite pleasantries, but inside, I was genuinely thrilled. It was the joy of a woman who could provide for herself, standing firmly on her own 2 feet. I stepped out of the corporate high-rise, the freezing wind slapping my face, and suddenly craved a proper, home-cooked meal. So, I stopped by a Whole Foods nearby, picked up a prime ribeye steak, some asparagus, mushrooms, and cherry tomatoes. On a whim, I grabbed a small bouquet of white baby's breath. They weren't luxurious flowers, just simple and rustic, but I thought they would look beautiful on the dining table. I wanted the apartment to feel warm when Kevin got home tonight. Leaving the supermarket, the rain had picked up. It wasn't a downpour, but the wind was tunneling fiercely between the buildings. I pulled my collar up, carrying the 2 grocery bags, and carefully navigated the wet steps heading back to our brownstone. Our building had a very classic, older Boston feel to it. The hallways were narrow, the yellow lighting was dim, and the brick walls showed their age. Every floor had its own distinct smell. The second floor smelled like someone's pot roast. The third floor smelled of laundry detergent. The fourth floor, our floor, smelled of damp brick mixed with the rain. I was used to it. Sometimes I even felt it was the literal breath of the place I called home. I reached our door, my hands heavy with groceries, the flowers tucked under my arm. My phone vibrated in my pocket, with congratulatory texts from my colleagues. I smiled, fumbling for my keys, my head still in the clouds from the successful meeting. And in that exact moment, I made a stupid mistake. I put the key in the lock, turned it, and opened the door straight away. I didn't ring the bell. It was only a second. But the moment the door cracked open, I froze, as if someone had violently yanked the back of my coat. Inside, there was no familiar, warm lighting. It was a dim, murky darkness. I suddenly remembered that Kevin usually turned on the living room lamps if he got home first, and even if he wasn't home, there was usually some light filtering in from the balcony. Today, it was unnervingly dark. I stepped in slowly. The first thing that hit me was a strange, cold chemical smell. It wasn't the dampness of the rain, nor was it food. It was the sharp scent of rubbing alcohol mixed with metallic grease, like opening a dusty toolbox in a mechanic's shop. That smell made my skin crawl. It didn't belong in this house, at least not the house I thought I knew. I stood completely still for a few breaths, telling myself to stay calm, but my heart was hammering against my ribs. I glanced around the living room. Everything was still neat. The chairs were straight, the pillows were aligned, the coffee table was clear. Classic Kevin. But the neater and quieter it was, the more I felt something was terribly wrong. This quiet felt times 2, times quiet. Over near the hallway, leading to the guest room, storage closet, there was a figure hunched over. I recognized Kevin's silhouette instantly, but he wasn't wearing his usual loungewear. He was wearing a black surgical mask and blue nitrile medical gloves. A weak beam of light from a small desk lamp was angled sharply downward onto a low, flat surface. I held my breath. On the floor, pressed against the baseboard, I saw a partially unrolled heavy plastic mat, the kind you use to protect hardwood from chemical spills. Next to it was a metal tray resting on a dark rag. The tiny components inside the tray were lined up with surgical precision. One look told me the person working here followed a strict, methodical protocol. They weren't just making a mess. Kevin was leaning close, his gloved hands manipulating something dark bronze, about the size of his palm, but with a highly complex structure. Tiny gears, microscopic milled grooves, and metal pins as thin as toothpicks. He was working so meticulously that in the dead silence, I could clearly hear the faint times, tick-tick-tick times of metal, scraping against metal. A wave of pure ice shot down my spine. I wasn't easily panicked. In my line of work, I had seen all kinds of liars and beautifully forged documents, but the scene in front of me was different. It didn't look like a guy fixing a toy or building a hobby model. It looked like something that required absolute secrecy, total sanitization, and hidden time. I wanted to call out his name, to ask what he was doing, but my throat had gone completely dry. I looked down at my hands. The bouquet of white flowers was trembling because my hands were shaking. Just then, an old saying echoed in my mind. Asterisk, to survive the devil, you have to play his game. Asterisk, I understood instantly. Now was not the time to play the wife. Now was the time to protect myself. I took one step backward, then another, pulling the heavy door closed as agonizingly slow as possible so the hinges wouldn't squeak. Out in the hallway, the freezing wind whipped my face, and the drizzle clung to my eyelashes. I leaned against the brick wall for a few seconds, trying to catch my breath. In my mind, there was only one chillingly clear thought. Asterisk, if I walk in by just opening the door, it means I broke the 4-ring rule. And if the 4 rings are our ritual, forgetting it might expose whatever Kevin didn't want me to see. Asterisk, I looked at the door in front of me like it was a borderline. Then, I raised my hand to the doorbell panel and pressed the exact, familiar pattern. Asterisk, ding ding, dying, ding. Asterisk, the chime echoed through the narrow hallway. It sounded so ordinary, but to me, it felt like a delayed request for permission. It was a way to pull myself back into the role of the happy, oblivious wife coming home from work. The moment I finished pressing the last ring, my fingers still hovering over the button, I heard movement inside. Not the sound of heavy, frantic running, but swift, incredibly efficient noises. The sound of someone packing up things they've packed 1,000 times before. The soft scraping of plastic, the faint clink times of metal, and then silence, followed by the extremely quiet zip times of a zipper, like someone closing a heavy canvas tool bag. I stood in the hallway, my back pressed against the cold brick. The rain stuck to my hair. My heart was pounding, but my mind was bizarrely lucid. I suddenly remembered the saying, asterisk, the smart ones can never beat the honest ones. Asterisk. But right now, being honest and asking him directly might be like putting a noose around my own neck. Just a few dozen seconds later, the deadbolt clicked. The door swung open. Kevin stood before me, wearing a gray t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair slightly messy as if he had just woken up from a nap. His smile was so familiar, so natural, that if I hadn't just witnessed what I did, I would have believed this was just an ordinary afternoon. "Hey, you're home early," he said, his voice entirely relaxed. I lifted the 2 grocery bags, forcing a joking tone to lighten the mood. Closed the contract. Wanted to eat a proper home-cooked meal. Kevin reached out to take the bags, then noticed the white flowers tucked under my arm. He raised an eyebrow, a gentle smile crossing his face. "You even bought flowers?" I shoved the bouquet into his hands, speaking quickly because I feared talking slowly would expose my trembling voice. "Saw them, thought they looked pretty. Put them in a vase so the place doesn't look so bleak." He leaned down and kissed my forehead. The kiss was warm, the classic gesture of a gentle husband, but strangely, it made me feel colder. Because right then, beneath the scent of the sandalwood incense he usually burned, there was still a lingering, thread-like trace of another smell. The sharp scent of rubbing alcohol and metal. Clinging stubbornly to his shirt, I stepped inside. The living room lamps were on, and everything was impeccably neat, as if no one had ever laid anything out on the floor. The area near the storage closet, where I had seen his hunched figure, was just an empty, spotless corner. In fact, it was 2 times spotless, like it had just been frantically wiped down. I didn't stare at it. I reminded myself. Asterisk. Staring means confessing that, you know. Asterisk, Kevin carried the groceries into the kitchen. "Go change your clothes. I'll cook. You won the contract today, so I'll carry the team for dinner." I laughed reflexively. The laugh sounded perfectly normal, but inside, something was scratching at the walls of my stomach. I went into the bedroom to change and wash my hands. The warm water ran over my skin, but it didn't warm me up. In the bathroom mirror, my face looked completely normal, except my eyes were slightly red from the wind and the rain. Or maybe from something else, I couldn't be sure. I walked back out to the kitchen. Kevin was rinsing the steak, slicing ginger, and prepping the pots. His movements were fluid, like a model house husband. He had always been like this: clean, efficient, orderly. Watching him, I used to think I was so lucky to marry a man who didn't drink, didn't party, and only cared about his wife and his small apartment. But today, as I looked at his hands, I noticed something strange. Deep in the crevice of the fingernail on his right index finger, there was a dark, reddish-brown stain. It didn't look like fresh blood. It looked like machine oil mixed with metal rust that had been scrubbed hastily and left a residue. A tiny stain that anyone else would have missed. But my entire career was built on the habit of noticing details. I pretended to open the cabinet for some bowls, speaking casually. "Did you get off work early today?" He didn't turn around. "Yeah, I left early to beat the traffic, then cleaned out some old stuff." I swallowed the question what stuff? Back down my throat. I didn't want to back him into a corner right now. My professional experience taught me that people lie best when they are confronted, but if you let them think you suspect nothing, they expose themselves more. Dinner was ready quickly: pan-seared steak, garlic sautéed greens, and tomato mushroom soup. It smelled wonderful, truly comforting. The TV was on low, the evening news mixing with the clinking of our silverware. The atmosphere was exactly like any other day. If you ignored the layer of ice freezing inside my chest, Kevin put a piece of steak on my plate. "Was the contract a big one?" "It's decent," I replied. "The client is difficult, but we mitigated the liability." He nodded approvingly. "You're brilliant." It was a light compliment, the kind that usually made me happy. Today, I just felt like he was desperately trying to pull our lives back onto its normal, predictable track. I decided to drop a very light test, like dropping a strand of hair into a pool to see if it spun. When I opened the door earlier, the house was completely dark. "Were you in the storage room?" Kevin's chopsticks paused for exactly one beat. Just one beat. Then he picked them back up and smiled. "The storage room? No. I was sorting through some mechanical samples a client asked me to review. They were cluttering up the place, driving me crazy." His voice was still smooth, his excuse perfectly logical. But that perfection made me even more anxious, because people only have a perfectly prepared explanation when they anticipate being interrogated. I gave a soft ah, and didn't ask anything else. I took a spoonful of the tomato soup. The sweet and sour taste was perfect, but it felt like a small rock was lodged in my throat. Outside, the freezing rain continued to fall, the wind whistling through the window frames, making the curtains tremble. I suddenly remembered a passive-aggressive comment my mother-in-law once made. If a woman can't bear children, how does she expect to keep her husband? Back then, I laughed it off. Now, the phrase surfaced like a sewing needle. If the man you're living with has an entirely separate secret life, how do you keep anything at all? After we finished eating, Kevin stood up to do the dishes immediately, just like always. I sat in my chair watching his back, feeling a mixture of pity and terror. Pity, because he was still attentive and kind. Terror, because kindness doesn't mean the absence of secrets. I walked over to help him. "Let me wash them with you," I said softly. He shook his head. "Go rest. You had a long day." He said long day as if he understood everything. Yet I had no idea what he actually understood. Did he think I was tired from the contract? Or tired from what I had just seen? I went into the bedroom and lay down, but I couldn't sleep. I listened to the sound of running water in the kitchen, the clinking of stacked bowls, and then his footsteps walking toward the storage room. Just once, very softly, like someone double-checking a lock. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to stay calm. Better safe than sorry. I had played by the rules of those 4 rings for years. I thought it was for our peace of mind. But it turned out, it might have just been to ensure I never accidentally crossed the boundary he was guarding. The night dragged on slowly, and inside that small, immaculate apartment, I began to realize a painful truth. Sometimes, the worst betrayals don't involve another person. They involve the secrets a partner hides right inside your own home, right next to you, every single day. After eating, Kevin washed the dishes so cleanly, it was obsessive. Once the soap was rinsed away, everything had to be bone dry, organized, and put back in its exact designated spot. I didn't stand next to him anymore. I was afraid that if I stood too close, I would see something else I shouldn't see, and I wasn't ready to name what was happening yet. I went into the bedroom, changed into my pajamas, and sat on the edge of the bed like someone exhausted after a long day. Outside the window, the freezing drizzle was still falling like mist, the yellow streetlights of the Boston alleyway reflecting off the tiny puddles on the pavement. Our small apartment was strangely quiet, the kind of quiet where people are actively trying to keep it silent. A little while later, Kevin walked in, wiping his hands on a towel. He brought 2 mugs with him, a cup of hot water for me, and one for himself. He placed it on my nightstand, his voice light. "Drink this. It's freezing out. It'll warm you up." I stared at the mug. A bizarre, indescribable feeling swelled in my chest. It was the feeling of being deeply cared for, yet being terrified to let my guard down. People say love smooths out all the rough edges. But sometimes, when there are thorns hidden inside that love, the smoothness only makes the sting hurt worse. Kevin sat down next to me. He didn't ask about the contract again. He didn't ask why I was quieter than usual. He just gave me a look and said, "My mom. She's probably going to call this weekend." I was slightly taken aback. I didn't expect him to bring up his mother proactively. Usually, he avoided the subject, offering a vague "I'll handle it." Today, he brought it up directly, as if trying to pull a different issue over the atmosphere in the room to mask the tension. I replied curtly, "If she calls, I'll answer. I always do." Kevin nodded, staying silent for a few seconds. Then he spoke, his voice slow. "Don't let her words weigh you down." It sounded like comfort, but to me in that moment, it held a hidden presumption that any heavy burden on my mind must be coming from my mother-in-law. I looked at him. I didn't smile, and I didn't scowl. I just asked very softly, as casually as asking about the rain. "Do you think I'm weighed down because of your mother, or because of something else?" Kevin turned to look me dead in the eye for exactly 1 beat. Then he looked down. He picked up his mug and took a small sip, like a man buying time to find the right words. Finally, he said, "You're just overthinking things." Just those 4 words, but I felt like someone had dropped a sheet of bulletproof glass between us. The glass was thin. We could still see each other, still talk, but touching it was ice cold. I told myself, stop asking. There's a saying. A smart eater stays full. A smart sleeper stays warm. Tonight, I had to keep my emotions bundled tight so they wouldn't shatter. Kevin stood up, grabbed his phone, and walked out of the room. I thought he was going to the balcony to water the small potted plants he loved so much, like he usually did. But no, he walked toward the storage room. His footsteps were incredibly soft, then stopped. I lay perfectly still on the bed, staring at the ceiling. I didn't want to turn into a paranoid, snooping wife from a movie, but I also couldn't close my eyes and believe everything was normal. The smell of rubbing alcohol and metal from this afternoon hadn't evaporated from my mind. It sat there like a dark ink stain on a white sheet of paper. A few minutes later, Kevin returned. His face was completely composed, as calm as if he had just gone out to grab an extra blanket. He pulled the curtains shut, turned off the overhead light, and turned to me. "Can you sleep?" I murmured. Honestly, I couldn't sleep, but I needed him to think I was asleep. Sometimes, when living with a secret, the awake person has to feign sleep so the other person reveals their true breathing rhythm. Kevin lay down. He turned his back to me, his usual sleeping position. But that night, from the very beginning, his breathing wasn't even. There were moments he let out a very faint sigh, like a man carrying a massive weight, but refusing to let anyone know. I tried not to move a muscle. I just listened. About 10 minutes later, his phone vibrated an incredibly weak buzz, meaning it was essentially on silent mode. He didn't turn on the screen immediately. He waited another beat before reaching for it. The pale blue light from the screen cast a faint glow on his cheekbones. He glanced at it quickly, his thumb swiped once, and then he locked it. He didn't reply. He didn't make a call. But right after, I saw his shoulders stiffen, like someone who had just read exactly what they didn't want to read. I squeezed my eyes shut tighter. An old phrase my mother-in-law used to lecture me with suddenly popped into my head. When a man has something on his mind, his face can't hide it. Asterisk, I used to ignore it. Tonight, I realized how true it was. The only problem was, I didn't know what was on his mind. Was it an issue from the outside world, or an issue right here in our home? A moment later, Kevin sat up abruptly. I'm going to get some water, he whispered. I didn't answer. I pretended to be deep in sleep. He stepped out. I heard his footsteps cross the living room and stop. I heard the refrigerator open, the sound of water pouring. And then, a very faint times, click asterisk, like a drawer sliding open. Which drawer? I knew every inch of the kitchen. So where was that drawer? My heart hammered against my chest. I desperately wanted to sit up and follow him, but I restrained myself. I was terrified of breaking this fragile equilibrium. My greatest fear was the moment he discovered I*'s new asterisk. Because if someone is hiding something, it means they have a reason to hide it. Kevin returned. This time, he lay down very quickly. He pulled the comforter up higher than usual, as if trying to cover his neck. I lay behind him, barely a hand's width away, but it felt like we were at opposite ends of a long, dark hallway. In the darkness, I suddenly remembered something my father-in-law, William, had whispered to me once when Barbara left the kitchen. Asterisk, living together, the most important thing is honesty. Asterisk, he had stopped talking immediately after, as if afraid his own words would cause trouble. I laughed bitterly to myself. Honesty sounds so simple, but it turns out honesty is the most expensive luxury in this house. I lay perfectly still, letting the seconds tick by. Outside, the freezing rain continued to patter gently. Inside, Kevin's breathing gradually leveled out. Maybe he was genuinely exhausted, or maybe he trained his breathing to sound that way. As for me, I felt my heart turning into a piece of wet paper, soft, heavy, and ready to tear if anyone touched it just a little too hard. I didn't cry. I just stared into the darkness in front of me and reminded myself of a brutal truth. Asterisk, knowing hurts once, not knowing hurts for a lifetime. Asterisk. But that night, I still hadn't made my choice. I only understood that from the moment I forgot to ring the doorbell. Everything between my husband and me would never fit together perfectly again. By the weekend, the freezing drizzle was still relentless. As the old folks say, it was a damp, bone-chilling cold that doesn't slice the skin but seeps deep into the marrow. Kevin told me to get dressed early so we could have dinner with his parents. He said it as casually as asking me to take out the trash, but my stomach immediately tied itself into knots. Not because I hated my in-laws, but because I had grown so used to the feeling that stepping into their house meant policing my entire existence. I had to correct how I sat, how I smiled, and even swallow my sighs. Asterisk, a word spoken is a bag of gold lost. Asterisk, that was how I lived at my in-laws' house. On the drive there, Kevin drove slowly, the windshield wipers swiping back and forth in a hypnotic rhythm. I looked at his profile. His face was still gentle, still composed, but his eyes lacked their usual ease. He kept his gaze fixed straight ahead, rarely glancing my way. When men fall silent, it's often not because they have nothing to say, but because they are choosing the safest option to avoid revealing anything. My in-laws lived in a classic suburban colonial house. The driveway gate was painted dark green, leading to a small brick-paved patio. The smell of roasting garlic and braised meat wafted from the kitchen, a very authentic, comforting smell of a family dinner. Entering the house, I bowed my head out of habit. "Hi, Dad." "Hi, Barbara." William was sitting in his usual wooden armchair. He turned and gave a slight nod, his voice deep. "You're here." That was it. But his simple "that was it" made it so much easier for me to breathe. Barbara, however, stepped out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. She looked me up and down, a smile as thin as a slice of ginger on her face. "Oh my. Look who finally decided to visit. Work keeping you that busy, dear." I smiled politely. "Yes, it's been a busy week, Barbara." She pressed her lips together, wiped her hands again, and turned to Kevin. "My son looks thinner lately, probably because his wife is too busy to take care of him." The words fell lightly, but I clearly felt the needle inside them. Kevin offered a polite laugh. "Mom, I can take care of myself." He said it to defend me. But Barbara didn't care about the defense. She just wanted to land her conclusion. The dining table was filled with dishes, as always. A perfectly roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, glazed carrots, and a fresh salad. It was obvious she had prepared meticulously. I knew she did it for appearances. When the daughter-in-law visits, the table must be grand, but a grand table doesn't equate to a warm one. As soon as we sat down, she put a large piece of chicken breast on Kevin's plate. Men who work hard out in the world need their nourishment. If you eat irregularly like this, who's going to take care of you? Then she turned to me, her voice still dripping with that fake sweetness. You should pay more attention to your role as a wife, Hannah. The most important thing is nurturing the home. A woman is only as good as the family legacy she builds, right? I bit my lip lightly and replied formally. Yes, I try my best. Barbara let out a long sounding like someone who had just heard the answer she demanded, not the answer she wanted. She took a sip of her water, her eyes darting quickly over my stomach. It was so fast that anyone else might say, I imagined it, but I didn't. I made a living analyzing those micro-expressions. She set her glass down and started her favorite tune, like an old record skipping to the same track. So, what are you two planning? It's been 4 years. You should have a plan for children. No profanity, no screaming, but that question felt like she had placed a massive scale right on the dining table and forced me to step onto it in front of the whole family. Kevin cleared his throat slightly. Mom, we'll get to it eventually. Barbara let out a humorless laugh. Eventually. Eventually when? The neighbors have grandchildren running all over their lawns. I'm not rushing you, but I'm getting anxious. I'm getting old. Everyone wants to see their grandkids. I gripped my fork tighter. A sentence flashed in my mind, begging to be spoken. Asterisk. If you want a grandchild so badly, try treating your daughter-in-law with some compassion first. Asterisk. But I swallowed it. I didn't want to turn dinner into a battlefield. And I didn't want Kevin stuck in the crossfire between his mother and his wife. So I just said softly, yes, we're hoping for it too, but it depends on God's timing. Barbara tilted her head. Timing is something you have to actively secure. Better safe than sorry. If you want a child, you need to live a balanced life. Stop being so obsessed with your career. Hearing that tasted bitter. She talked about balance, as if I were the sole cause of our situation. Meanwhile, Kevin sat perfectly still, his eyes glued to his plate, slowly chewing his food. He would occasionally offer a very short, non-committal response, just enough to keep the table from falling into dead silence, but never enough to actually stop his mother. My brother-in-law, Dylan, was also there that day. He came out of the back room late, grinning the moment he sat down. Hey Mom, Dad. Hey Kevin, Hannah. Jesus, it's freezing out there. The wind is like a debt collector. His joke broke the tension for a second. Dylan put a piece of chicken on my plate and muttered softly, Eat up, Hannah. Don't let it get to you. He spoke incredibly quietly, but I heard the defense in his voice. Barbara glared at Dylan. Eat your food properly, and stop talking nonsense all the time. Dylan smiled apologetically and looked down at his plate. He didn't argue because he knew arguing would only make his mother angrier, and the more angry she got, the more she would take it out on someone else. During the meal, I paid closer attention to William. He didn't interject, only occasionally passing food or pouring water for Barbara. But at one point, when she repeated the line about the house times, needing times a grandchild, he put his fork down very quietly, didn't look at anyone, and said something as light as a breeze, but I heard it clearly. Barbara, the food is good. Let's talk less. Barbara stiffened for exactly 1 beat, then forced a laugh. I'm just telling them so they know what they need to worry about. I looked at William, my heart aching. He didn't stand up for me by slamming his fist on the table, nor did he lecture his wife in front of the kids. He just said one sentence to draw a boundary. For an older man who had lived under her thumb for decades, saying that much was an act of profound compassion. After dinner, I stood up to help clear the table. Barbara didn't stop me. She just watched me wash the dishes, her voice slow and deliberate. What exactly do you do again? Risk compliance? Sounds fancy. But a woman can be as fancy as she wants. It doesn't mean a thing if she isn't blessed with a child. I washed the third plate, my hands turning ice cold. I understood her message perfectly. Money and a career couldn't save my position as a daughter-in-law if I didn't produce an heir. It was character assassination, dressed up as moral philosophy. While I was rinsing the plates, Kevin walked into the kitchen and asked quietly, "Are you okay?" I looked at him. I wanted to say I wasn't okay at all, but I just nodded. "I'm fine." Kevin exhaled, like a man who had just dodged a dangerous bullet. He stood next to me, watching me work, but he didn't dare reach out and touch my hand. I suddenly found it tragically hilarious. A husband and wife, standing shoulder to shoulder in his mother's kitchen, acting like two strangers, terrified of breaking protocol. As we were leaving, Barbara walked us to the door, still smiling her thin smile. "All right, head home. You two need to figure things out. I won't nag you, but I'm expecting good news." I bowed my head slightly. The car rolled down the driveway. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw her standing on the porch, arms crossed over her chest, looking more like a warden than a mother. Inside the car, Kevin was silent. I was silent too. The two silences stacked on top of each other, as heavy as the pouring rain. I watched the water streak across the window and thought about the saying, asterisk, a daughter-in-law is technically a daughter. A son-in-law is a guest. Asterisk. But in some families, the daughter-in-law is forever just an applicant trying to prove she deserves to stay. And right in that moment, a realization hit me that made my heart colder than the wind outside. Kevin could avoid his mother with silence, but he couldn't avoid her forever. Just like me. I could endure a tense dinner. I could endure a barbed comment. But if there was another secret hiding somewhere in our marriage, this endurance was going to cost me dearly. That night, when we got back to the apartment, I didn't put on any music, nor did I turn on the TV. I hung my coat on the rack, changed my clothes, and went into the kitchen to boil some water. Kevin maintained his usual meticulous routine. He opened the door, immediately took off his shoes, placed his keys in their exact spot on the tray, and hung his jacket perfectly straight. Before, that routine made me feel secure. Tonight, it made me feel like everything was a carefully curated set designed to ensure no one noticed the parts that were out of alignment. We had a very simple late-night snack. Not because we lacked food, but because we were both experiencing the kind of exhaustion that makes you not want to speak. Kevin asked if I was cold, if I wanted a hot drink. I said I was fine. My tone was polite, like I was talking to a gentle, well-mannered guest. It was strange we were husband and wife, yet here we were, constantly walking on eggshells around each other. After eating, he washed the dishes. I didn't fight him for the chore. I just sat at the kitchen island, clutching my warm mug of tea, watching the condensation bead on the window pane. Outside, the wind howled through the narrow alleys of our building complex, carrying the earthy smell of the rain. But inside my mind, there was a completely different scent. The cold, sharp smell of rubbing alcohol and metallic grease kept swirling in my memory. Kevin finished the dishes and turned to look at me. "You should go to sleep early. You have work tomorrow." I nodded. "Okay." He stood up and walked toward the master bathroom. I heard the water turn on, then the steady drumming of the shower head. Normally, the sound of the shower was comforting, a signal that our evening routine was returning to normal. But tonight, it felt like a curtain he pulled across the stage to hide whatever he didn't want me to see. I didn't follow him immediately. I sat there for a bit longer to calm my nerves. I knew that if I barged in and started asking questions with a trembling voice and red eyes, I would lose the upper hand instantly. They say to kill a snake, you have to strike the head, but I didn't want to strike a snake barehanded, and I certainly didn't want to make a lot of noise and give the snake time to hide. I stood up and walked quietly past the living room, heading toward the guest bathroom. We rarely used this bathroom, unless we had company or when I needed the utility sink for hand-washing delicates. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open gently. The moment the door opened, that smell of rubbing alcohol hit me again. It wasn't the sterile smell of a hospital. It was cold and sharp, mixed with the distinct odor of metal, like opening a mechanic's toolbox. That smell couldn't have materialized naturally. I stood still for a second, then quickly scanned the room. not looking for an obvious object, but looking for time's traces asterisk. Traces are usually found where people assume no one will look. Behind the pedestal sink, in the corners of the baseboards, behind the trash can. I crouched down near the base of the sink. Tucked right against the grout line, there was a tiny scrap of white material. I used 2 fingers to pull it out. It was a torn piece of a blue nitrile medical glove. The edge was jagged, like it had been ripped off violently in a rush. I held it up, goosebumps erupting down my arms. This wasn't an everyday item in our household. I didn't work in healthcare. Neither did Kevin. So where did it come from? I placed the scrap of glove on a tissue and looked over at the trash can. The guest bathroom trash can was usually empty, but today, the lid was slightly askew, as if someone had hurriedly shoved something inside. I popped the lid. Inside were a few crumpled paper towels. But what caught my attention was the empty cardboard core of a roll of heavy-duty tape and several alcohol-soaked wipes. The smell of rubbing alcohol was overwhelming. The wipes were crumpled and stained with dark streaks. It wasn't dirt. It looked like industrial grease or metal shavings. I didn't need a forensic investigator. I didn't even want a forensic investigator. Some things are clear enough with just one look. This was the aftermath of a cleaning process. Wiping away fingerprints, sanitizing the evidence, scrubbing it clean so no one could track it. I stood frozen. A phrase suddenly echoed in my head. Asterisk, you can't wrap fire in paper. Asterisk, true, but people still try. They try to wrap it, cover it, wipe it away, thinking no one is watching. I grabbed a small Ziploc bag from the vanity cabinet, the kind I used for travel toiletries. I placed the torn piece of glove, the tape core, and the alcohol-soaked wipes inside, then sealed it tight. My movements were slow and deliberate, like a detective logging evidence, not someone picking up trash. I didn't hide the bag in the bathroom. I carried it out and stuffed it into the inner pocket of a winter coat, hanging in the hallway closet, a pocket no one would ever check. I knew I wasn't acting like the good wife right now, but I also knew that if I wanted to save this marriage with the truth, I had to have something solid to hold on to. I couldn't just rely on gut feelings. Just then, the shower in the master bathroom shut off. I jumped, quickly rushing back to the bedroom and sitting on the edge of the bed, pretending to scroll through my phone. My heart was racing, but I forced my face to remain completely neutral. I suddenly understood the sheer exhaustion of living with a secret. The exhaustion comes from constantly having to perform. Kevin walked out, his hair still wet, wearing clean pajamas. He sat down on the edge of the bed, rubbing his hair with a towel, and asked, "You aren't asleep yet?" I replied, "I was waiting for you. It's freezing in here." He chuckled softly and reached out to feel my forehead. A familiar habit. No fever, probably just the weather. I looked at his hand. His fingernails were much cleaner than they were this afternoon, but there was still a very faint, dark line embedded deep in the cuticle of his index finger. That stain instantly reminded me of the items I had just hidden in my coat. I didn't ask about it. I just said, "Yeah," and lay down. Kevin turned off the lamp. Darkness swallowed the room, just like every other night. He turned his back to me and pulled the comforter up, his breathing gradually slowing down. As for me, I lay near the edge of the bed, my eyes wide open in the dark. I listened to the wind whistling through the window frame. I heard the faint drip of water from the shower drain. I heard my own heartbeat. For the first time in my marriage, I felt like I wasn't lying next to a husband. I was lying next to a man who had an entire sector of his life I had never stepped into. And he had built a security fence using a superstition. Asterisk, better safe than sorry. Asterisk, I had dutifully followed the 4-ring rule for years. I thought it was for our safety, but it turned out it might have just been designed to ensure I never accidentally crossed the boundary he was guarding. I closed my eyes, but I couldn't sleep. I didn't want to comfort myself with the phrase, "I'm probably just overthinking it," anymore. The contents of that Ziploc bag in my coat pocket were small and weightless, but to me, they were a terrifying, ice-cold reality. The secret wasn't out there in the world, it was right here in my home. Right inside the guest bathroom, a place I had always believed held nothing but spare soap and warm water. The next morning, the Boston sky was a sullen, bruised gray. The freezing drizzle was still falling in patches, not enough to soak your clothes, but enough to chill you from the inside out. I woke up earlier than usual, not because I was eager to start the day, but because there was a wire strung tight in my head that refused to slacken. Kevin woke up early, too. He wore a crisp dress shirt, buttoned all the way up to the collar, maintaining his usual immaculate routine. Before leaving, he even opened the shoe cabinet and quickly wiped a tiny smudge off the toe of his dress shoes with a tissue. It was so meticulous, I used to find it endearing. Today, it just looked like a highly practiced method of erasing evidence. Make sure you eat breakfast. Don't skip it, he said, reaching for his keys. I nodded, forcing my voice to sound normal. I will. Drive safe. He paused for a fraction of a second at the door, looking at me. His eyes held something that looked like he wanted to ask, "Are you okay?" But he didn't. He just said, "I might be home late tonight." I answered immediately, "Don't worry about it. Focus on work. I'll be fine here." After I said it, I realized my response sounded more like someone trying to reassure themselves rather than a wife reassuring her husband. Kevin didn't notice, or maybe he pretended not to. He opened the door and stepped out into the hallway. And then, as if by pure reflex, he rang the doorbell 4 times before pulling the door shut behind him. Asterisk ding ding, dying, ding. Asterisk the chime echoed, then faded into the sound of the elevator descending. I stood perfectly still, listening to that familiar rhythm, but my heart no longer felt warm. The moment the door locked, I turned back toward my home office. I am not the type of person to rely on gut feelings and just sit around waiting. My profession taught me that if there's a risk, you turn it into data points. The clearer the data, the less you panic. I opened my laptop, turned on my desk lamp, and sat up straight. The numbers appeared on the screen, as familiar to me as the faces of relatives. It was our joint bank account. I didn't go looking for massive, glaring withdrawals. If someone has a dangerous secret, they rarely move giant lumps of cash and leave a massive trail. I looked for the times, consistent times, transactions. Consistency is a habit, and habits are incredibly hard to hide. I filtered the transactions by month, then applied a recurring pattern model, exactly the protocol I used when auditing corporate risk. At first, everything looked completely mundane. Electric bills, the water bill, parking garage fees, Whole Foods runs, a few Venmo transfers to the plumber. I exhaled slightly, telling myself, asterisk, maybe I really am just being paranoid. Asterisk, but as I scrolled deeper, a specific line item caught my eye. It sat there quietly, identical month after month, like a nail hammered into the ledger. On the 12th of every month, a wire transfer of exactly $250. Recipient, asterisk Apex Mechanical Restorations. Asterisk once, twice. I kept scrolling. It was there every single month, as reliable as a prescription refill schedule. I scrolled back 1 year. 2 years. 2.5 years. The amount never changed. The date never changed. It never missed a single beat. I sat completely paralyzed. $250 isn't a life-ruining amount of money, but it's enough to prove this wasn't just a spontaneous purchase. This was a commitment, a contract hiding in plain sight. I clicked into the transaction details. The receiving entity wasn't listed under a CEO's name, but under a Chief Financial Officer routing code. That meant this money was moving through a structured, administrative pipeline, not just a casual Venmo to a buddy. I opened the memo notes attached to the transfers. They were always just 2 vague words. Asterisk, service fee. Asterisk. What kind of service fee gets paid exactly on the 12th of every month for 2.5 years straight? I suddenly remembered my mother-in-law's passive-aggressive lectures. She was always saying, finances need to be transparent. A woman needs to know exactly where the money goes. Yet here, in my own house, there was a steady, underground current of cash flowing out every month. Kevin had never mentioned it. I had never asked, because I believed that a married couple shouldn't have to scrutinize each other like IRS auditors. Now I realized how naive I had been. Trusting someone too much means that by the time you realize you shouldn't have, it's usually too late. I didn't blame Kevin at that exact moment. I just felt a thin layer of my faith shatter completely. I opened a new browser tab and searched for Apex Mechanical Restorations. The search results were bizarrely sparse. A few vague lines about industrial repair and mechanical restoration. An address located in an old, run-down warehouse district along the Chelsea Creek on the outskirts of the city. No clear photos, no notable business activities, no media presence. It was a company existing entirely as a shadow. I looked at the clock. It was barely past 8 a.m. The apartment was dead silent, save for the whirring of my laptop fan and the freezing drizzle tapping against the window. I suddenly felt like I was sitting in an interrogation room rather than my own home, because the silence wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. I took screenshots of the bank statements and saved them into a secure, encrypted folder. I gave it a completely sterile name. *AMR 12 250 *. I didn't want to name it Husband's Evidence or Secret Fund. I needed a cold, analytical brain. The colder the file name, the less likely I was to let my emotions derail me. While saving the files, a terrifying thought crossed my mind, making my chest tighten. If this recurring payment was connected to what I saw yesterday afternoon, then the 4-ring doorbell wasn't a quirky romantic gesture. It was a buffer, a mandatory preparation window. And if someone goes to such lengths to prepare, whatever they're doing isn't harmless. I stood up and made another cup of ginger tea. My hands were still functioning normally, but my stomach felt like it was full of lead. I looked out the window at the courtyard below. A few elderly neighbors were walking to the corner bodega with umbrellas, hunched over but moving steadily. It looked so normal. It was so normal it terrified me, because right in the middle of this suffocating normalcy, my house had an underground pipeline draining money every month. I sat back down at my desk, opened my phone, and scrolled to a specific contact, Tyler Grant, an old college friend who now worked as a senior cybersecurity analyst. He was the kind of guy who could find the digital footprint of a ghost. I didn't hit call immediately. I stared at the screen one more time, just to make absolutely sure I wasn't hallucinating the bank statements. Then I reminded myself of something my dad used to say. Asterisk. If you want to know the truth, don't ask the mouth. Ask the trail. Asterisk. And the trail here was the money. I took a deep breath. My finger hovered over the call button. I wasn't shaking, but I was freezing cold. Because I knew that once I pulled on this thread, I could never pretend I hadn't seen it. And sometimes, the most terrifying thing isn't the secret itself. It's the exact moment you confirm it actually exists. I hit call. It was 8:45. Tyler picked up almost immediately. His voice had that same half-awake, cynical drawl I remembered from college. Hey, Hannah. Calling me this early. Guessing it's not to catch up on old times. I didn't beat around the bush. Tyler, I need you to run a background check on a company called Apex Mechanical Restorations. Tyler went silent for exactly 1 beat. It was the specific kind of silence a professional hacker gives when they smell something bad. When he spoke again, all the sarcasm was gone. Where is Apex located? What do you have on them? I kept it brief, stripping out all the emotion. Recurring bank transfers. $250 on the 12th of every month for 2.5 years. I suspect it's tied to something Kevin is doing privately. Tyler exhaled sharply. Send me screenshots of the statements, but do not send them over regular text or iMessage. Use Signal. Once I confirm receipt, delete the messages on your end immediately. My blood ran cold. Nobody gives instructions like that for normal family drama. I sent the files exactly as he instructed, then asked point blank, "Do you see a red flag?" Tyler didn't answer right away. He just delivered a short, brutal warning. Hannah, do not dig into this alone. I forced a nervous laugh. I'm not digging. I'm just asking a friend to look. Just asking a friend is enough for someone watching to know you're looking at the wrong thing, Tyler said dryly. Before I could ask what he meant, he switched into full operational mode. Let me dig into this. I'll message you when I have something. Until then, do not mention this to anyone. Not a single soul, not even your family. I understood that family included not just my parents, but my in-laws. I murmured an okay and hung up. After hanging up, I leaned back in my chair, staring at the search engine page still open to Apex Mechanical Restorations. The information was still incredibly sparse. It was unnaturally barren. I tried tweaking the search terms. I added the zip code, then the tax ID number I pulled from a state registry database. Finally, an obscure link popped up. It was a tiny, archived news blurb from a defunct local paper. Just a few lines summarizing a fatal workplace accident at a warehouse associated with mechanical restoration operations. No specific names, no photos, no detailed descriptions, no follow-up investigations. It read like a mandated PR release meant to be glanced at and forgotten. But that extreme vagueness gave me chills. I worked in risk management. I knew that the more vague a major incident is, the more someone paid to keep it vague. I thought about the smell of rubbing alcohol and metal grease. I thought about the surgical gloves. I thought about the 4-ring doorbell. Individually, these tiny details could be explained away. But stacked together, they were forming a terrifying mosaic. I stood up and walked to the balcony to get some air. The freezing wind slapped my face, but my temples were burning. I told myself to stay calm. Asterisk, big ships face big waves. Asterisk, I chose to live as an independent adult. If a crisis hits, I have to handle it like one. I decided to run a quick errand, not far, just down to the ground floor of our building complex. To clear my head, I threw on my heavy winter coat, grabbed my wallet, and out of sheer habit, walked to the front door. I stopped for half a second, looked at the doorbell panel, and pressed it. Asterisk, ding ding, dying, ding. Asterisk, I suddenly found it darkly hilarious. I was ringing the bell now not out of romantic habit, but out of fear. Fear that something inside my own home needed time to hide. But Kevin was at work. The apartment was empty. I was pressing it purely out of a reflex that had morphed into paranoia. I locked the door and walked down the stairs. The stairwell floor was damp, smelling of wet brick and old rain. In the courtyard, a few older women were huddled under the awning, complaining about grocery prices and someone's sick grandchild. Life was carrying on with such agonizing normalcy. It was so normal it felt cruel to someone who had just been dragged into the abnormal. I walked down to the resident parking garage where I kept my Honda sedan. I figured I'd drive to a nearby bakery to grab a coffee, but as soon as I looked down at the rear passenger tire, I froze. The tire was completely flat. There was a single, massive gash in the sidewall, not a puncture from a nail or a piece of glass. It was a clean, brutal slice, at least 4 inches long, made by a heavy, razor-sharp blade. It was intentional. I stood up straight and whipped my head around. Cars were driving in and out. A few residents were walking to their vehicles. No one was looking at me. No one looked suspicious. But that complete lack of a suspect is what terrified me the most. The person who did this didn't need to stand around and gloat. They did it and left. They just left a message. A message that said, asterisk, we know exactly who you are. Asterisk, I swallowed hard. Tyler's warning flashed in my brain. Asterisk, do not dig into this alone. Asterisk, I hadn't even started digging, and I was already receiving threats. That meant someone had been monitoring me long before I opened my laptop today. Or, someone incredibly close to me was involved. I touched the edge of the gash. The rubber was freshly shredded. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I didn't scream. I didn't call building security. I knew that making a massive scene would only put a spotlight directly on me. I pulled out my phone, snapped a photo of the slashed tire, and sent it to Tyler on Signal with 3 words. Asterisk, tire got slashed. Asterisk, Tyler replied almost instantly. Asterisk, are you at the apartment? Asterisk. Asterisk, I'm in the parking garage. Asterisk, I typed back. Asterisk, do not stand there. Walk to a crowded street. Call AAA or a tow truck, and absolutely do not take your usual route if you decide to walk back home. Asterisk, I stared at the screen. He didn't ask who did it. He just immediately issued evasion protocols. That was the reflex of someone who dealt with dangerous situations daily. I backed away from the car and walked quickly out to the main avenue, where there was heavy foot traffic. I called a mobile tire repair service and waited inside a busy Dunkin' Donuts across the street. The mechanic arrived, took one look at the tire, and shook his head. "Someone sliced this good, lady. That's a combat knife, not a pothole." He said it so casually, like he was discussing the weather, but my heart plummeted into my stomach. I thanked him and paid the bill while he swapped it for the spare. Sitting on a bench inside the donut shop, clutching my purse, I remembered a classic piece of advice. Asterisk, avoid the elephant, and you won't get trampled. Asterisk. But how the hell do I avoid an elephant I can't even see? An elephant that just leaves a clean slash on my tire and the lingering scent of rubbing alcohol? I sat there watching the crowd of Bostonians rushing by in the freezing rain, and for the first time, I understood with crystal clarity. My situation was no longer just a marital dispute about hidden hobbies. It had breached the walls of my home and touched something incredibly dark on the outside. Something dangerous enough to issue a physical threat without uttering a single curse word. I paid the mechanic, thanked him, and started walking. I didn't head straight back to the apartment. I walked a long, convoluted loop around the neighborhood, exactly as Tyler advised, altering my pace and crossing streets randomly. My mind was blaring one undeniable fact. Asterisk. Someone is watching me from the shadows. Asterisk. And if they are watching, their next move won't just be a car tire. I finally returned to the apartment just before noon. The entire walk back, I intentionally took busy streets, stopped at a random cafe to buy a hot tea I didn't want, and took the long way around the block before finally entering my building. I wasn't doing it to be dramatic. It was a pure survival instinct. Whoever slashed my tire wanted me to know I wasn't safe. As soon as I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the familiar smell of sandalwood incense hit my nose. But today, the scent didn't bring me any comfort. It felt like a heavy curtain trying to mask something foul underneath. I told myself, asterisk, don't panic. Panic makes you blind. Asterisk. I took off my heavy winter coat, hung it on the rack, and instinctively reached into the inner pocket. The Ziploc bag containing the torn surgical glove and the alcohol-soaked wipes was still there. It weighed practically nothing, yet it felt like a boulder against my chest. I had barely poured myself a glass of water when my phone vibrated. I looked at the screen. Asterisk, mother-in-law. Asterisk, Barbara rarely called me in the middle of the day. She usually called in the evening, right after dinner, when my guard was down and I was more likely to be compliant. Calling at noon meant she was anxious about something. I took a deep breath, answered the call, and kept my tone perfectly respectful. "Hi, Barbara. How are you?" "I'm fine, dear," she started, her voice coated in that familiar, artificial sugar. "How are things with you and Kevin? Is everything okay?" "Yes, everything is fine," I replied calmly. She let out a soft chuckle. "Well, that's good. I was just checking in. Kevin has been coming home quite late the past few days, and he sounds so exhausted on the phone. I worry about him." I knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't worried like a normal mother, checking on her son's health. She was probing. She was trying to extract information about what was happening inside my house. I gave her the most generic, Teflon response possible. His workload is just heavy right now. End of the year, projects piling up. She hummed. Then, she abruptly changed course. "By the way, how is the front door to your unit? Dylan mentioned your building has those heavy security doors. Do you need me to send a locksmith I know to come take a look at your locks? Just to be safe?" I went completely rigid. The question sounded incredibly innocent, but it struck the exact nerve I was terrified of. Asterisk the locks. The door. Asterisk. How do I answer this without revealing that I'm already highly suspicious? I forced my voice to remain even. "Oh, the door is perfectly fine, Barbara. The locks work great." "Oh, good, good," she laughed tightly. "I was just asking. You know how it is, honey. Break-ins are getting so sophisticated these days. A woman home alone needs to know how to protect herself." Her words sounded like motherly concern, but I heard the sinister undertone clearly. Asterisk. She knows I'm home alone often. She wants me to remember that I'm not as safe as I think I am. Asterisk, I swallowed hard. "Yes, I know. Thank you." She rambled on about a new neighbor, some gossip from the grocery store, and ended the call with a light but sharp dagger. Well, I won't keep you. Just remember, if anything happens, you tell me. We are one family, no secrets. Of course, I smiled politely to the empty room. I hung up and sat dead still on the couch. I wasn't afraid of Barbara. I was terrified of how she managed to ask exactly the right questions while maintaining the facade of a caring mother. It meant one of three things. Either someone was feeding her information, she had a terrifying intuition, or worst of all, she was somehow involved. I didn't dare jump to conclusions, but I knew one thing for certain. My in-laws were no longer my backup. They could very well be a surveillance camera, and I had no idea who was watching the feed. I was about to text Tyler when my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Dylan. Asterisk, hey Hannah, you home? Asterisk, I replied quickly. Asterisk, yeah, I'm home. Asterisk, he hesitated, the typing bubble appearing and disappearing, before finally sending. Asterisk, Mom was just asking me some really weird questions. She asked about spare keys, about your apartment door, and what Kevin's been up to lately. I told her I didn't know anything. She looked at me like she was interrogating me. Asterisk. I gripped my phone tightly. Asterisk. Spare keys. Asterisk. That was the exact thread I was pulling on. I couldn't tell Dylan everything, telling him might just create another vulnerability. But Dylan was the rare person in that family who seemed to actually care about my well-being. I replied, mixing truth with caution. Asterisk. I noticed she was acting a bit strange too, but I'm not sure why. Just keep it to yourself, pretend you don't know anything. Asterisk, asterisk, got it, asterisk, Dylan replied. Asterisk, stay safe, Hannah. Don't let Mom get under your skin. Asterisk, asterisk. Thanks, Dylan. Asterisk. I put the phone down and stared at the key rack by the door. We only had 2 sets of keys to this condo. I had one, Kevin had the other. We never gave a spare set to his parents. But if my mother-in-law was suddenly asking about spare keys, it meant she wanted a way into my apartment without announcing herself. A shiver racked my body. Right at that moment, my phone vibrated one more time. An unknown number. It wasn't a call. It was a text message. Just 3 words. No punctuation, no greeting. Asterisk. Stay safe, kid. Asterisk, I stared at the screen, my eyes burning. Not from emotion, but because those words felt far more like a dire warning than a friendly check-in. My father-in-law, William, rarely texted me. If he was sending me a burner message, there was a massive reason. I typed back a brief reply. Asterisk. Yes, Dad. Asterisk. I didn't ask times. Stay safe from what? Asterisk. Or times. What do you know? Asterisk asking questions over text leaves a digital trail. I just gave the polite acknowledgement, but in my mind, the final nail had been driven into the coffin. William knew something was wrong. At the very least, he knew the family dynamic was turning toxic, or he knew someone from the outside was touching our lives. I stood up and walked over to the window, looking down at the courtyard. An elderly woman was carrying groceries. A man was trying to fix a broken umbrella. Kids were splashing in puddles under the awning to escape the freezing rain. Life was so painfully normal. It was so normal it felt cruel to those of us being dragged into something utterly abnormal. I walked back to my laptop, intending to text Tyler about Barbara's sudden interest in locks and my slashed tire, but my fingers hovered over the keyboard. I remembered Tyler's strict warning. Asterisk, leave as little trace as possible. Asterisk. I decided to send exactly 1 sentence. Asterisk, mother-in-law is probing about door locks and spare keys. Asterisk, Tyler replied a few minutes later, incredibly brief. Asterisk, lock down your routines. Change your transit routes. Beware of the person closest to you. Asterisk, I read the message, and my blood turned to ice. Asterisk, beware of the person closest to you. Asterisk, that hit me like a physical blow. Who was the person closest to me? My husband, my in-laws, my neighbors, the garage attendant. Anyone could see my habits. Anyone could hear things that seemed insignificant. I finally understood why people say tragedy often starts from an open mouth. But here, it wasn't just my mouth. It was the ears of the people around me. I stood in the center of my apartment, realizing that this small, cozy space was no longer a safe box. It was a glass cage. I thought it was secure, but people on the outside could still watch my every move. I didn't cry. I quietly walked to the front door, checked the deadbolt, checked the chain, looked through the peephole. Then I sat down at my desk, opened a blank mental page, and wrote myself a new set of rules. Asterisk. Speak less. Take different routes. Do not believe in coincidences anymore. Asterisk. Because once the in-laws start sniffing around, it means someone is blowing smoke their way. And this smoke didn't smell like a home-cooked meal. It smelled like a dangerous secret leaking out. Leaking from the outside in, or from the inside out. By late afternoon, Tyler still hadn't called back. His silence made me even more anxious. I knew that in the cybersecurity world, if it were a simple issue, he would reply quickly, maybe even throw in a joke to ease my nerves. If he was silent, it meant he was digging deep, or weighing how much it was safe to tell me. I went to the consulting firm as usual, forcing my face to remain composed. I signed a few more compliance documents and sat through a brief strategy meeting. My colleagues were laughing, discussing where to grab drinks this weekend. I smiled along, throwing in a casual comment here and there so I wouldn't seem entirely disconnected. But inside my head, every conversation was running parallel to a much darker narrative. A narrative involving rubbing alcohol, metallic grease, and a $250 transaction firing off like clockwork. When work ended, I didn't go straight home. I stopped at a small, obscure coffee shop in an older part of town, choosing a booth in the far back corner. This accomplished two things. It prevented me from returning to an empty apartment too early, and if Tyler called, I could actually hear him. I ordered a hot tea, clutching the mug to warm my hands while staring out at the freezing rain through the glass. People hurried by in dark coats, heads down against the wind. It was a perfectly ordinary Boston scene, but to me, it felt like a current of water where anyone could be hiding, watching me. Just before 7 p.m., Tyler messaged me on Signal. He didn't call, just one line. Asterisk might be tied to a hardware module. Do not discuss this inside your apartment. Asterisk, my heart seized. Tyler rarely used specific technical jargon with me. If he was calling it a module, it meant this was far beyond domestic infidelity. I replied quickly. Asterisk, meet me in person, not over the phone. Asterisk. I stared at the screen, my chest burning with anxiety. But I understood that things you can't say over a phone are things you fear will be intercepted. Tyler replied. Asterisk, where? Asterisk, I sent him the location of a noisy, crowded clam shack we used to go to near our old college campus. The tables were packed tightly together, the noise level was deafening, and eavesdropping was virtually impossible. I added one more instruction. Asterisk, come alone. Don't take your usual route. Asterisk, I paid for my tea and walked out into the freezing wind and rain. I hailed a cab, purposely giving the driver a route that looped around the city before heading to the restaurant. During the ride, I constantly checked the rearview mirror and monitored the cars behind us. Not because I was certain I was being followed, but because I couldn't be certain I wasn't asterisk. The clam shack was tucked into a narrow street, neon lights cutting through the thick steam billowing from the kitchen vents. Tyler was already sitting in a booth, wearing a dark hoodie, a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. When he saw me, he gave a curt nod. No loud greetings. He slid a bowl of hot clam chowder toward me and spoke as if discussing the weather. Eat. It's freezing. I picked up the spoon, but my hands were shaking slightly. Tyler looked at me, lowering his voice to a near whisper over the din of the restaurant. Hannah, are you absolutely certain your husband is a clean player? I choked. Tyler, give it to me straight. Tyler pulled out his phone but didn't unlock the screen immediately. He scanned the crowded room before leaning in, delivering every word like a hammer strike. Apex Mechanical Restorations isn't a normal company. It's a ghost shell. I held my breath. Tyler continued. You know what a ghost shell is, right? No advertising, no marketing, no public footprint, but money moves in and out consistently. It's a container. A container meant to hold something else. What else? My voice rasped. Tyler lowered his voice so much, I had to lean in to hear him. There is something referred to in the chatter as the core. I don't know who named it that, but it popped up in some dark web data fragments I scraped. It's a highly sophisticated mechanical digital lock module. Simply put, it's a physical key designed to open a digital vault. What kind of vault? I asked, feeling my blood run cold. A transaction ledger, slush funds, black market money trails, lists of shell companies, drop men, that sort of thing. I felt physically sick. I worked in corporate risk compliance. I knew exactly what a slush fund ledger meant. It wasn't just money. It was an entire criminal syndicate. It was leverage. It was something people were fully prepared to murder for, to keep hidden. Tyler put his spoon down. Do you understand now? If your husband is connected to this hardware, you are standing right next to a pile of dynamite, and someone has already lit the fuse. I looked down at the steaming chowder, but all I felt was ice. I kept my voice as steady as possible. Do you have hard proof? Or is this just a theory? Tyler gave a slight nod. Not enough to hand to the FBI for a conviction, but enough for a massive red flag. The recurring payments are 1. The shell company footprint is 2. And there's something much more alarming. Tyler pulled a small, folded piece of paper from his pocket. It had a few alphanumeric strings scribbled on it and one specific alias. He didn't hand it to me directly. He just slid it under his bowl so anyone looking would assume it was a napkin. In certain circles, they refer to your husband as the master. My throat tightened so hard, I felt like I was being strangled. Asterisk, the master. Asterisk. It sounded like a dramatic nickname for a highly skilled craftsman, someone who pulled the strings. But in this context, it was a terrifying target painted on his back. Tyler, how do you know that's Kevin? I asked, struggling to maintain my composure. Tyler looked me dead in the eye. I didn't invent it. It showed up on a server I really shouldn't have been looking at, but coincidentally, it was attached to data packets directly linked to Apex. I sat in stunned silence. Over the loud chatter of the restaurant, the clinking of beer glasses, and the rain hammering the tin roof outside, my mind locked onto a single, terrifying thought. Asterisk. You can't wrap fire in paper. Asterisk. The fire was already burning. I could smell the smoke. No one was just willing to admit it yet. Tyler finalized his warning, his tone deadly serious. From this moment on, you have to assume that every conversation inside your apartment is compromised. Do not store anything sensitive on your personal phone. And absolutely do not interrogate your husband and back him into a corner. I forced a bitter laugh. You think I have the guts to interrogate him? I don't even know who the man I married actually is anymore. Tyler looked at me, his eyes a mix of sympathy and intense vigilance. They slashed your tire today, Hannah. That was a warning shot. If you let them know you are actively digging, they won't stop at your car. A violent shiver ran through my body. I wanted to ask more, but Tyler was already standing up, urging me to finish eating and leave. He didn't want us sitting together for too long. Establishing a predictable meeting pattern was a fatal mistake. We split up outside the restaurant. Tyler headed one way, I headed another. I took a completely different route home, much longer and through heavily populated areas. My mind raced, frantically trying to organize the chaos into a logical checklist. Asterisk the core, the master. Apex, the $250. The rubbing alcohol, the surgical gloves, the slashed tire. My mother-in-law probing about the locks. My father-in-law telling me to stay safe. Asterisk. As I neared the apartment complex, the night had fully set in. The hallway lights were dim, the shadows long and menacing. I gripped my purse like a weapon. When I finally reached my front door, I stopped. Not because I forgot my keys, but because I suddenly felt a profound terror looking at the doorbell. I pressed it anyway. Asterisk. Ding, ding. Dying. Ding. Asterisk. There was no sound of rustling inside, so Kevin probably wasn't home yet. I unlocked the door and turned on the lights. The apartment was as pristine and silent as a tomb. But today, The silence wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of a trap waiting to be sprung. I hadn't even taken off my coat when my phone vibrated in my hand. An unknown number. My heart slammed against my ribs. I hesitated for a split second, then answered. The voice on the other end was a low, gravelly rasp, heavily distorted, like a man speaking through a metal pipe. The words were slow and freezing cold. Hannah Carter. I stood perfectly still, my hand gripping the phone in a death grip. Who is this? The voice ignored my question. He spoke as if stating an inevitable fact. You shouldn't be so curious. I could hear my own rapid breathing echoing in my ears. He continued, his tone dropping even lower. The master needs to deliver the merchandise soon. The deadline is up. Don't do anything stupid. Then, a click. The line went dead. The screen faded to black. I stood in the middle of my living room, feeling like someone had just dumped a bucket of ice water over my head. Not just because he threatened me, but because he called me by my full name, and he used the exact alias Tyler had just warned me about. It meant Tyler was entirely correct, and it meant I had already been placed on a surveillance watch list long before today. I was the master's wife, a convenient label that told them exactly how to leverage me if necessary. I slowly turned my head to look at the storage room door. It was shut tight, completely silent. But in my panicked mind, I felt as if a monstrous shadow was lurking inside, waiting. I swallowed hard. I didn't scream. I didn't call the police. I stood absolutely motionless for a long time, then placed my phone on the coffee table as gently as if I were setting down a live grenade. And in that exact, terrifying moment, I heard the heavy deadbolt on the front door click open. Kevin was home. The lock clicked slowly, and the heavy door swung open. Kevin stepped inside, his winter coat still dusted with freezing rain. He pulled off his mask, hung his keys precisely on their hook, and bent down to align his shoes perfectly parallel to the baseboard. His routine was so flawlessly normal, it was as if the terrifying, distorted voice that had just threatened my life over the phone didn't exist in the same universe. "You're home early," he said, his voice exhausted but trying to sound warm. I stared at him. If this were last week, I would have rushed over to take his bag and ask if he had eaten. Today, I just stood there. A freezing chill was shooting straight up my spine, not because of the draft from the hallway, but because that gravelly voice had just called me by my name and called him times the master asterisk. I didn't answer his question. I just spoke very slowly, my voice devoid of emotion. "Sit down." Kevin froze. He looked at me for a split second, then quickly scanned the living room as if searching for a guest, but the apartment was empty. There was only me, and a suffocating, dense atmosphere. He walked over to the armchair and sat down. I pulled out a dining chair and sat opposite him. I kept enough distance between us so we could see each other clearly, but far enough that neither could reach out and touch the other to offer false comfort. I placed my phone face down on the coffee table. Then, I reached into my purse and pulled out a manila envelope, the one I had prepared earlier that afternoon. "Kevin," I said. It was the first time all day I called him by his actual name, instead of honey. He replied softly. "Yeah?" I opened the envelope and pulled out the printed bank statements. I didn't slam them down dramatically like in a movie. I just set them on the glass table and slid them gently toward him. "Please explain this to me." Kevin looked down. I watched his eyes track the highlighted line, asterisk Apex Mechanical Restorations, asterisk. His shoulders locked up for exactly one beat, just one heartbeat of pure tension, but it was enough. I saw that the man sitting across from me was a master at hiding his emotions, but the human body cannot lie. He looked up. "Why are you looking at this?" I kept my voice perfectly level. "I am your wife. It is our joint account. I have the right to look." And I looked because I have been finding very strange things in this house. I didn't wait for him to ask questions. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the small Ziploc bag. I didn't dump it out. I just placed it right next to the bank statements. Inside the clear plastic was the torn piece of blue nitrile glove, the cardboard tape core, and the alcohol-soaked wipes stained with dark metallic grease. I looked him dead in the eye. I found this hidden in the guest bathroom. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the ticking of the wall clock. Kevin didn't touch the Ziploc bag. He just stared at it like it was a venomous snake he wished didn't exist. I continued, my voice never rising or falling. You told me you were cleaning up some mechanical samples. So why did you need surgical gloves? Why did you need industrial rubbing alcohol? And why did you desperately try to hide the trash in a bathroom we never use? Kevin pressed his lips together tightly. He stayed silent for a long time. It wasn't the silence of someone being stubborn. It was the silence of a man calculating his odds. Asterisk. If I speak, who dies? If I don't, do I lose my wife? Asterisk. I didn't rush him. My professional experience taught me that when someone is internally weighing a confession, pushing them only makes them shut down completely. Finally, he exhaled. His voice was raspier than normal. What did you see? I didn't tell him I saw him directly manipulating the lock core under the desk lamp. Saying that would reveal that I had opened the door without ringing the bell. I didn't want to lie, but I had to give him a calculated, partial truth. I opened the door straight away yesterday afternoon. I saw you near the storage room, and the apartment smelled heavily of alcohol and metal grease. Then I stepped back out, rang the bell 4 times, and when you opened the door, you had cleaned everything up in seconds. Kevin closed his eyes. It was a brief, painful wince, like a man having his armor peeled off layer by layer. I pressed on, refusing to let emotion make my voice tremble. You didn't invent the 4-ring rule just because the door is thick, did you? He opened his eyes and looked at me. There was something resembling an apology in his gaze, but he clearly didn't know where to start. I delivered the final blow, still without raising my voice. You wired $250 every single month to Apex Mechanical Restorations. You've done it for 2.5 years. I'm asking you directly. What is Apex, and what the hell are you keeping in this apartment? Kevin dropped his head, interlacing his fingers until his knuckles turned white. He remained silent for another agonizing minute before enunciating every single word clearly. I am not doing anything dirty. I let out a short, humorless laugh. I didn't say you were doing anything dirty. I asked what you are doing. He swallowed hard, then looked up, meeting my eyes directly for the first time during the interrogation. I am holding a piece of something that should not exist. Hearing that sentence made the hairs on my arms stand up. It was exactly what Tyler had alluded to. Only now, I was hearing it from my own husband, in my own living room. I asked slowly and distinctly, "Is that object called the core module?" Kevin flinched. It was a microscopic flinch, but enough to tell me I hit the bullseye. He didn't ask how I knew. He just looked at me like someone watching a civilian wander into an active minefield. "Where did you hear that?" he asked. I didn't tell him about Tyler. I didn't want to drag Tyler into the crossfire before it was absolutely necessary. I simply said, "It doesn't matter where I heard it. What matters is that my car tire was slashed with a combat knife this morning. And tonight, right before you walked in, I received a blocked call. The man on the phone called me by my full name." I watched the color completely drain from Kevin's face. The panic wasn't because he was afraid of me. It was because he realized times had finally touched me. He jumped up from the armchair, pacing the living room like a trapped animal. Then he stopped, looking at me, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "You cannot answer calls from unknown numbers anymore." I remained seated, perfectly calm. I didn't seek the call out. "But they know my number. They know my name. Explain to me why they know who I am." Kevin rubbed his forehead, breathing heavily. "I'm sorry. I tried so hard to keep you out of this." I gripped the edge of my chair, fighting the urge to scream, "Asterisk, it's a little too late for that." Asterisk. Instead, I asked, "Keep me out of it for what?" "So you could live in a home where you only had to enter when I gave you permission by waiting for those 4 rings, Kevin murmured, almost to himself. "I didn't want you involved, because if they know you're involved, they will use you as leverage against me." My throat tightened, not because of his confession, but because I knew he was absolutely right. They had already started using me as leverage with that phone call. I stood up slowly. I didn't step closer to him. I stayed exactly where I was, maintaining my position not as a begging wife, but as an equal. "Kevin," I said. I am going to ask you one last time. What are you holding? And why do they call you the Master? Hearing the alias the Master, Kevin went rigid, as if someone had just stabbed him in an old wound. He whipped around to face me, his eyes darkening with a terrifying intensity. He didn't answer immediately. He walked over to the table, looking at the Ziploc bag, then at the bank statements. He exhaled a breath that sounded like it was dragged up from the bottom of his lungs. I got tangled up in this before we ever met. I thought that once we got married, I could cut ties, but you can't just walk away from these people. So what is Apex? I asked. Kevin gritted his teeth. It's the front operation where they fabricated the lock, and you hold the key to it. He gave a barely perceptible nod. Yes. I didn't ask further details about black market ledgers or digital vaults, because I knew that saying too much out loud in this apartment could be fatal. I just said one sentence to finalize the reality. You don't have to tell me everything, but you have to tell me one thing clearly. Is my life in danger? Kevin looked straight at me, his eyes bloodshot, his voice resolute. Yes, just one word, but it weighed more than a 1,000-page lecture. I stood frozen, feeling the floor tilt beneath me. I thought of my mother-in-law probing about the door locks, my father-in-law texting me to stay safe, the slashed tire. I realized none of it was a coincidence. Kevin stepped forward, reaching out to take my hand. I pulled my hand back, not out of disgust, but because my hands were freezing cold, and I was terrified that if I trembled, he would break down entirely. I spoke, my voice completely even, but every word sliced like a razor. Then from now on, do not force me to live in the dark anymore. I am your wife, not a prop for you to hide behind your back. Kevin squeezed his eyes shut and gave a very slow nod. He whispered, I know. I'm so sorry. Before I could say another word, the living room lights flickered violently and then went pitch black. The moment the lights died, I froze, feeling as if someone had grabbed me by the collar and violently yanked me backward. The darkness suffocated the room in a fraction of a second. Pure reflex made me look toward the crack under the front door. The hallway outside was still dimly lit by the emergency bulbs. I could see the yellow light filtering through the peephole. It wasn't a building-wide blackout. Kevin, I whispered, my voice barely more than a breath. Kevin was no longer sitting still. I heard the soft scraping of his chair against the hardwood floor. He moved swiftly toward the breaker box, near the kitchen entrance, but after half a step, he stopped dead in his tracks. He spun around, pressed a finger to his lips, and signaled me to remain absolutely silent. 1 beat, 2 beats. Then I heard it. A microscopic sound coming from the front door. It wasn't a knock. It wasn't a doorbell. It was the rhythmic metallic scratching of steel against steel. It was as light as someone popping the tab on a soda can, but it sent a paralyzing chill straight down my spine. Someone was picking the deadbolt, and they were doing it with terrifying, professional efficiency. I swallowed hard. In the pitch-black apartment, every sound was brutally magnified. My own breathing sounded deafening. My heartbeat felt like a bass drum. Kevin moved close to me, grabbing my wrist and pulling me backward with incredible, steady force. I could feel his hand was ice cold, but his grip was unyielding. He leaned in, his lips brushing my ear, whispering so faintly I had to strain to hear him. It's not a blackout. They cut our specific breaker. I shuddered violently. If they cut our specific unit's power, it meant the people outside knew exactly how the building's electrical grid was wired. They knew exactly which panel to hit. These weren't petty burglars from the street. The metallic scratching at the door continued, followed by a very faint Times click, asterisk. A secondary tumbler had been bypassed. I suddenly remembered a warning my father used to give me when I was young. Asterisk, thieves aren't afraid of strong locks. They're only afraid of an awake homeowner. Asterisk. But right now, I wasn't sure how much being awake mattered, because I was standing in a pitch-black apartment, and my front door was seconds away from being breached by professionals. Kevin pulled me tight against the wall and whispered rapidly, giving me no time to process. Get into the storage room. Now. Before I could even react, he was physically shoving me down the short hallway. We moved through the darkness, relying entirely on his spatial memory of our home. He didn't turn on his phone flashlight. He didn't activate any light source at all. The fact that he instinctively knew not to use light proved he had anticipated this exact nightmare and had mentally prepared for it. We reached the door of the storage room. He shoved me inside and pulled the door shut behind us, with virtually zero noise. The scent of old wood and dusty paper flooded my nose. Outside in the living room, I heard another distinct, heavier metallic times snap asterisk. The lock was giving way. Inside the pitch-black storage room, Kevin used his hands to trace the edge of the massive, heavy bookshelf pushed against the back wall. I couldn't see clearly, but I heard the extremely soft times, shh, times of a drawer sliding out, followed by a sharp times, clack times, as a hidden mechanism released. "Push the shelf with me," he commanded in a breathless whisper. I put my shoulder against the edge of the massive wooden unit and shoved. For something so heavy, it slid sideways with surprising ease, as if it had been mounted on concealed industrial tracks. When the bookshelf moved, it revealed a false panel in the drywall behind it. Kevin pressed a specific spot on the panel, and it popped open, revealing a hidden, incredibly cramped compartment built into the structural void between the walls. I stood paralyzed in shock. I had lived in this apartment for 4 years. Yet, right behind the bookshelf, there was a panic room I knew absolutely nothing about. The compartment was barely large enough for one person to crouch inside. On the floor sat a small folding stool, a black duffel bag, a heavy-duty portable power bank, and an old, battered smartphone. Mounted to the ceiling of the compartment was a tiny pinhole camera lens, wired directly through the drywall to face the living room. Goosebumps erupted across my skin, not just out of fear, but from the overwhelming feeling of being utterly deceived. I thought I was the master of this house. It turned out, I was only allowed to walk in the illuminated areas he designed for me. Kevin shoved the burner phone into my hands. His voice was frantic, but possessed an iron resolve. "Stay in here. Do not make a sound. Do not open this panel, no matter what you hear out there." I choked back a sob. "What about you?" He looked at me, his eyes glowing red in the faint ambient light filtering through the crack. "I have to make them believe I'm out here alone." I wanted to grab him and scream times. "Don't go asterisk," but my throat felt as if it were being crushed in a vice. The instinct of self-preservation screamed in my head, but we were husband and wife. There is no every man for himself when you are pushed to the brink of death together. I grabbed his sleeve desperately. "Kevin, if they get in, what are they looking for?" He only had time for one short, brutal sentence, delivered like a guillotine dropping. "They're looking for the core." Before I could ask what the core actually was, he pried my fingers off his sleeve and shoved me backward into the compartment. I dropped into a crouch. He pulled the false wall shut. The darkness inside the compartment was absolute, thick as ink. The only source of light was the dim screen of the burner phone, which was streaming a live feed from the pinhole camera. Out in the living room, the metallic scratching at the front door abruptly stopped. A terrifying, heavy silence descended, the kind of silence right before a thunderstrike. Asterisk, crash, asterisk. The front door was violently kicked open, the deadbolt shattering the wooden frame. The camera feed on the phone vibrated violently from the impact. The living room on the screen was dark, but the yellow light spilling in from the hallway was enough to illuminate the silhouettes. 3 massive figures surged into the apartment. They moved incredibly fast and with tactical precision. No one flicked on a light switch. No one yelled. They didn't act like burglars. They acted like a hit squad. A deep, synthesized, metallic voice, the exact same voice from the phone call, echoed through the room. "Where is the module?" I saw Kevin step into the edge of the camera frame. He positioned himself squarely between the intruders and the hallway, leading to the storage room. His posture wasn't panicked. He raised his hands slowly, as if trying to buy time through negotiation. The second shadow lunged forward. A brutal, sickening thud times echoed as a fist collided with flesh. Kevin staggered backward but didn't fall. The third man ignored the altercation completely and walked with terrifying purpose straight toward the storage room. He didn't look at the TV. He didn't check the kitchen cabinets. It was as if he had memorized the blueprints of my home. I bit down on my lip so hard I tasted copper. Cold sweat poured down my spine, despite the freezing temperature. I wanted to smash the panel open and scream, but Kevin's final command times, "Do not open this panel. No matter what you hear," times was nailed into my brain. The third man yanked the storage room door open. His massive silhouette blocked the camera feed momentarily. He was ransacking the room with brutal efficiency. I heard him pulling out drawers, tearing through boxes, tapping the walls lightly, searching for hollow spaces. He operated with a terrifyingly practiced ease. Another violent times, thud times echoed from the living room. Kevin was thrown brutally against the wall, collapsing to his knees. The metallic voice spoke again, dead and monotone. "Don't make this difficult. Tell us where the module is. Asterisk, master. Asterisk." Hearing that alias spoken aloud in my own home felt like a knife dragging across my eardrums. I gripped the burner phone so tightly my fingers went numb. On the screen, I saw Kevin slowly lift his head, his face bruised and bleeding. He pressed his lips together and shook his head. I didn't know if he was shaking his head because he didn't know where it was, or because he knew and refused to tell them. The man in the tactical vest stepped forward and leaned down close to Kevin's face. The camera feed glitched wildly, static lines ripping across the screen. There was the horrific sound of another heavy blow, a sickening crunch, and then the screen went entirely black. The video feed was dead. I sat trapped inside the cramped wall compartment, terrified to take a single breath. The darkness inside seemed to swallow the frantic beating of my heart. I pressed my ear flat against the drywall. Outside, I heard the heavy, frantic thudding of combat boots, the screeching of furniture being dragged across the floor, and the rapid, violent sounds of a targeted search. And then, a sudden, agonizing silence. A silence so profound and heavy, it felt like I was slowly turning to stone. I didn't know how much time had passed. I only knew that when I checked the digital clock on the dead phone's lock screen, an eternity of minutes had vanished. Out in the hallway, I could hear the faint, muffled sound of a neighbor walking up the stairs, completely oblivious to the nightmare that had just unfolded feet away. The sheer, banal normalcy of the outside world made me want to lose my mind. I remembered Tyler's strict instructions. Asterisk, leave no trace. Asterisk, and my father-in-law's text. Asterisk, stay safe. Asterisk, I bit my lip again, forcing my brain to operate like the forensic investigator I was. In a high-risk, catastrophic event, the absolute first priority is preserving your own life. I waited. I waited until my ears couldn't detect a single sound inside the apartment, only the wind howling through the shattered front door and the freezing rain hammering the roof. I slowly raised my hand and pressed against the edge of the false panel. It was freezing cold. I pushed gently. It didn't budge. I ran my fingers along the seam, searching for the exact pressure point Kevin had hit earlier. I found a slight indentation and pressed hard. A faint click times echoed, and the panel popped open an inch. I squeezed myself out of the compartment, my legs completely numb from crouching for so long. The storage room was shrouded in darkness, but the ambient light from the hallway revealed utter devastation. Everything had been shredded and tossed aside. I stepped cautiously into the living room. The apartment looked like it had been hit by a localized tornado. Chairs were overturned, drawers were ripped from their tracks, and books were scattered across the floor. But what terrified me the most wasn't the mess. It was the targeted, surgical nature of the destruction. They only destroyed exactly what they needed to search, completely ignoring valuables. I spun around. Kevin was gone. I rushed toward the wall near the hallway where I had last seen him on the camera feed. On the hardwood floor, there was a long, dark, smeared stain, like someone heavily bleeding had been dragged across the floorboards. I dropped to my knees and touched it. It was wet and freezing cold. My heart seized in a violent spasm. I looked toward the front door. The heavy deadbolt mechanism was mangled, the door frame splintered and shattered. I stood up, trembling uncontrollably, but I didn't cry. In my mind, one horrifyingly clear fact solidified. They didn't come to rob us. They came for the module, and when they couldn't find it, they took my husband to torture it out of him. I bent down and picked up my personal cell phone from the coffee table. The screen was black, but intact. I didn't scream for help. I didn't call 911. I just unlocked the screen and stared at Tyler's last warning message. I scanned the wrecked apartment one more time, burning every detail into my memory so no one could ever gaslight me into believing I imagined this. I walked into my home office, pulled open the bottom desk drawer, and retrieved the Ziploc bag containing the torn glove and the alcohol wipes. It was still there. I clutched it to my chest like a fragile lifeline, the only physical proof I had that I wasn't insane. Standing in that freezing, dark apartment, listening to the rain fall, I confronted the brutal reality. From this exact second, I was no longer a dutiful daughter-in-law playing by the rules. I had just been violently dragged onto a chessboard, and the game had already started without me. I have no idea what time it was. I only remember that outside the shattered window, the Boston sky was the color of dirty dishwater. The freezing drizzle was still falling, and the wind was whistling through the splintered doorframe, making the torn curtains flutter like ghosts. The apartment looked as if a bomb had gone off inside it, but the most terrifying aspect wasn't the chaos. It was the eerie, undeniable feeling that whoever had done this had left with total, arrogant confidence, as if this home had never belonged to me in the first place. I stood dead center in the living room, my spine coated in ice. My brain desperately clung to the core principle of my profession. Asterisk. When a catastrophic risk event occurs, do not surrender to emotion. Gather the data first. Asterisk. I took a deep, shuddering breath and began analyzing the apartment like a crime scene. It wasn't a bloody murder scene. It was a scene of calculated extraction. They didn't take the flat-screen TV. They didn't take the emergency cash stashed in the kitchen. They didn't even touch the jewelry box hidden in my dresser. That meant their sole objective was the object they called the core. And they dragged Kevin away because he was the only one who could give it to them. Thinking about Kevin being tortured made my throat constrict violently, but I refused to let myself break down. Breaking down right now meant death. I walked slowly back toward the storage room, the epicenter of the destruction. Under the dim yellow light bleeding in from the building's hallway, I noticed a few deep scratches gouged into the hardwood, as if something incredibly heavy had been dragged across it. I dropped to my knees, running my hand along the baseboard. My fingers brushed against something freezing cold. A tiny, dark bronze piece of metal lay wedged against the wall, buried under a pile of shredded documents. It was small, no bigger than the top joint of my thumb, but when I picked it up, it was surprisingly heavy for its size. The surface was etched with microscopic, precision-milled grooves, and one edge was jagged and sharp, as if it had been violently snapped off a larger mechanical component. I clenched the shard of metal in my freezing palm. I knew instantly. This was either a piece of the device they were tearing the house apart to find and accidentally left behind, or it was a breadcrumb Kevin intentionally dropped for me. Regardless of which it was evidence, and I could not afford to lose it. I grabbed a clean tissue from the kitchen counter, wrapped the metal shard tightly, and shoved it deep into the inner breast pocket of my coat. I didn't put it in my purse. A purse can be snatched. This needed to stay strapped to my body. I surveyed the wreckage one more time, and a terrifying realization crystallized in my mind. If they breached my home this easily, they could return at any second. I couldn't stay here, but I also couldn't run out into the night empty-handed. I bypassed the chaos and walked straight into Kevin's home office. This room was usually immaculately organized, his architectural blueprints stacked perfectly. Today, the drawers were ripped out, papers littering the floor like fallen snow. I didn't waste time looking at the scattered debris. I searched for the one thing Kevin always kept hidden in the deepest recess of his desk: a black, leather-bound moleskin notebook he carried on every construction site visit. I checked the top drawers. Nothing. I checked the filing cabinet. Empty. I stood still for a heartbeat, then dropped to the floor and looked under the heavy oak desk. A tiny corner of black leather was peeking out from beneath a fallen stack of folders, as if it had been dropped in a frantic rush and kicked underneath. I yanked it out. The black moleskin. I clutched it to my chest, as if I were holding a piece of my husband. For the first time that night, tears burned the back of my eyes, but I only let them burn. I refused to let them fall. Crying makes you weak, and I needed to be lethal. I sat in his desk chair and opened the notebook. The first few dozen pages were filled with standard architectural sketches. Kevin's line work was incredibly precise, the scaling perfect, the notes detailed, but halfway through the notebook, the drawings changed entirely. They shifted from buildings to complex mechanical engineering diagrams, concentric interlocking circles, gear ratios, locking pins, and cryptographic symbols I didn't fully understand. But the sheer detail proved he had been designing this mechanism for a very long time. I flipped frantically to the very last page. My heart hammered against my ribs. The final page contained only a few hastily scribbled lines. It was Kevin's handwriting, but jagged and erratic, as if written by a man whose hands were shaking, racing against a ticking clock. Asterisk. If you are reading this page, it means I didn't make it back in time. Do not return to the apartment. Do not call my family. The metal shard is just a decoy. They will hunt for the rest of it at all costs. If you decide you want to find me, start at the coffee shop where we first met. Asterisk. I sat paralyzed. Not out of shock, but because every single word felt like a physical blow to my chest. Asterisk. Do not call my family. Asterisk. That meant his deepest fear wasn't me panicking. It was information leaking to his parents. And times, the metal shard is just a decoy. Asterisk. That meant the actual prize they were hunting wasn't just in the apartment. What they wanted was massive, and it was hidden somewhere else. Kevin had meticulously mapped out an escape route, preparing for the absolute worst-case scenario. And that realization hurt more than the physical violence I had just witnessed. I slammed the notebook shut. My hands were trembling slightly, but my mind was operating with terrifying clarity. I had to leave the apartment immediately. I couldn't go to my in-laws. I couldn't go to my parents. I couldn't even call the nosy neighbor across the hall. At this point, avoiding a scandal didn't matter anymore. The only thing that mattered was staying alive and following the trail. I went into the bedroom, grabbed a dark, inconspicuous duffel bag, and threw in a set of dark, practical clothes, my ID, a stash of emergency cash, and a heavy-duty portable charger. I didn't pack a rolling suitcase. Suitcases make noise and draw attention. I packed light, like a woman heading to the gym. I stood in front of the mirror for a fraction of a second. My face was ghostly